the scripture, it's understanding the dynamic that you have to be honest in life, that you have to treat other people like you'd like to be treated yourself. And we're hearing a lot now, certainly in the UK, we're hearing a lot from many of the more modern Muslim leaders of saying Muslim is a religion of tolerance, because that is a spiritual principle. You can understand why we're hearing that now. The Christian churches, it has moved away by and large, apart from the evangelical wing, they're saying much less about the scriptures, and they're saying much more about being a good human being. Because that's the frame of reference that so much more people in Britain are using now. So why is spirituality? Because spirituality allows me to live in conjunction with you. It goes back to when I said we live as a herd, we live as a group. How can we live as a group? We need spirituality to guide us in doing that, so we intuitively live together. We will always fall out, but we can use our spiritual principles to come back together again. When society abandons its spiritual principles, when individuals abandon their spiritual principles because they become isolated and things, then they cannot make functioning relationships. So I brought this discussion all the way back round to this notion of somebody who is not well from a mental point of view is somebody who cannot make functioning relationships with anyone, not just their primary relationship, but a relationship with the teacher, a relationship with their peer group, a relationship with their parents and things. Somehow it's always dysfunctional. And that is mental illness. That is what mental illness is. Now, there might be many different reasons why those things don't work. It might be schizophrenia, it might be personality disorder. There are different levels, there are different intensities, but essentially they're all about not being able to make functioning relationships. For the lower area of mental disorders that might fall into personality disorder, schizotypal, that kind of thing, that we can use talking therapies, and essentially 12 steps is a formulation of talking therapies that is there for lay people to work with other lay people. We can build on that with our person-centered skills, with our psychodynamic skills, to build a much more powerful talking therapy that can bring up that recovery rate that we talked about yesterday in AA. In the Western world, certainly, I can't speak for India because I simply don't know the figures, but it may well be the same, that only 3 to 10% of people stay in meetings. AA is a wonderful thing, 12 steps is brilliant, but only 3 to 10% of people get well from it. The others have blockages that require professional help to remove. In Addictions UK, we built up that recovery rate to 70%, which I think is fairly impressive. And I think other people can do that as well. It's by, that is the difference between using a layperson and using professional skills to remove the blockages. So if we're going to work with spiritual work, and if we're going to work with belief and things, but we're also going to work as professionals, what we should be concentrating on is removing the blockages that stops that flower that Roger's talked about growing intuitively towards the sun. That is our role. The 12-step work, we can still reflect and talk about and say how that fits into our role, but by and large we can leave that to other people who spend their time working much more with, this is the 12-step philosophy. But we, as professionals, we make that relevant to other individuals and we remove blockages. So I guess that was what Spirits and Spirituality was going to be all about. That's no reference to spiritualism, fortunately, nor spirits that we drink, which would be another play on words. Has anyone got any questions?
Yeah, in the UK you have this program called SMART.
Yes!
So they are very clear on the fact that they don't want to follow, they tend to sort of be very careful not to look into spirituality or spiritual principles or use the word God. So do you feel that somebody following SMART would still be able to take the advantage of this this building up on the principles of 12 step, like how would you compare it, you know?
Okay. Well, first of all, smart recovery is basically rational emotive behavioural therapy.
Yeah.
So it has a tradition, and it is one tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not going to say that, like, I think you can get well purely with CBT, but your chances of getting well are reduced. You can get well with 12 steps, going to a 12-step meeting, but only 10% of people are going to get well. CBT, only 10% of people are going to get well. Psychoanalytical, another 10% of people. There'll be different 10% that are relevant to them all. But I think you can get to that 70% by building the things in. And the skill of being a practitioner is, where do I need to use this integrative skill with this client? Now, smart recovery has become attractive because there is a misnomer that AA is about religion.
Exactly.
Now, in 1935's America, where it all came from, I'll challenge that statement slightly later on. In 1935 America, where AA and Bill W. And Dr. Bob got together and things, you have to remember that as a Western culture, America is the most Christian. It is. And the reason for that is that, for one reason or another, many of the Christian sects left Europe for the New World in America, so they could practice their religion in a way they felt that they could, because they felt, well, they would argue they felt persecuted in England. There is an argument to say that the rest of us in England felt persecuted by their extremism, so we said, hey, do get on the Mayflower, very nice, have a nice life over there, thanks for going. And that's been fine until they grew up to be the United States of America, and then they come back. A little American imperialism there. But my point is that, and I've forgotten what my point is actually, my point is that, yes, religious things, it came out of this religious background. And for all that Bill W. and Dr. Bob understood that they wanted to reach beyond just religion, they wanted to take these religious principles but apply them to a wider world, which is exactly what Carl Jung said to Bill W. He said, look, I know a way that people can get well. They have this kind of religious experience. Take the dynamics of that and build it into your program.
Yes.
And that's what Bill W. did. And he openly stole and he said, I've stolen them. He stole them from the Oxford group. The working steps through 4 till 9. He stole them and used them because not only does it make better Christians, it makes better people. It will make better Muslims, it will make better Hindus, because it's the spiritual principles that underlie all of those religions. But he was living in America that was deeply Christian, that's built into their politics, still is today. He had to bring this thing forward, and to avoid being called a cult and being outlawed and being ridiculed, he had to bring in Christian dynamics into it. He had to make it seem as though, he said, God as you understand it. That was as far as they could push it. That's my understanding of that. But if you read, there's a 12-step book, 12 Steps, 12 Traditions. And in one of the traditions, early on in the book, they say, don't worry about this. You can be an atheist. The vice president of the Atheist Society was able to make rings big enough to jump through without compromising the fact he said he was an atheist. I read that and I thought, well, I can do this as well. You know, I can figure this out for myself. How do I make this relevant? How do I fit this into my terms of reference? Not many people, or many people don't feel able to do that. They balk at the first thing they hear. The first time they hear the word God, they think, oh, Christian loonies, I'm out of here. You know, they're going to be banging a tambourine and all of this stuff. I'm not going to do any of that. I have to say to you, however, in my second and third meeting, I thought that, ooh, I really want to get well, because my alternative is to die. If I have to become a Christian to do it, then maybe I'll have that right. Maybe I'll do that. Later on, I began to explore what is belief, and fundamentally I said, well, you know what? I don't believe Christian theology. You know, I'm not even sure that from my scientific viewpoint, I don't think you even need a God figure to explain how the universe works and things. That doesn't mean to say you don't need that spiritual thing that I talked about earlier, that belief thing. It's just I don't choose to believe that a God made the world and makes the universe work. I have other explanations for that. But I do know that you need belief to live. And I guess, somebody asked me this the other day, and they said, so what's a world where there's no belief? And I said, a world with no belief is where I found myself full of despair, desperation, desolate blackness, that all I wanted to do when I came to was drink as much alcohol as possible, to take as much drugs as possible, that I could render myself unconscious. That is a world without belief. And, you know, belief is fundamental to being a human being. So I will challenge smart people and say, yeah, great, REBT, good stuff, it works. But, you know what? You do have belief. You might, they think, when I say belief, they, oh, I don't believe in God. I'm talking about you believing in God. I'm talking about you having belief. You know. So I always ask people, what do you believe in? What do you think is important? I'll spend hours working on what they think is important. And that becomes their good, orderly direction, their God. So we're back to working with atheists. But you know, even the smart people have a belief. But I really think that by picking and mixing from the different schools that are available, you increase your chances. You know. Fundamentals, AA people, oh, you don't need counsellors, you don't need psychologists, things, they're bad, and things. Well, okay, you didn't, because maybe you didn't have too many blockages, maybe you could find your way from that. And don't get me wrong, I think that the 12-step book is wonderful. You can parachute the 12-step book into a group of alcoholics, and one of them might pick it up and get some idea and talk to the other one, and you start getting the fundamentals of recovery in place, and it has enabled hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to get well without professional help, which we can be honest about this as well. In the Western world, certainly that professional help was not being given. So what other choice did they have? But now that we see recovery is possible, we don't have to lock people up in institutions or do what the Romans did. The Romans had a wonderful cure for alcoholism. You took an alcoholic, you took some molten lead and you poured it down their throat. They died, but hey, the other alcoholics are not going to get like them, are they? They did. They just did it secretly. You know, and I'm sure in every culture you can find. But hey, you know what? I watched a program on I hesitate to use the word primitive, because that's not really a fair way to describe. It was in the Far East, and it was a culture that was not advanced and didn't understand what epilepsy was. They thought that epilepsy was a curse, and they decided that perhaps a good way to get the curse out of the person was to hold them over a fire. You know, and that is kind of, it's tragic, but when you don't understand, people didn't understand alcoholism, they didn't believe you could get well. I will invite you to look at a book, I can't remember who writes it, but it's called Circles of Recovery. And it contains at least 150 different philosophies for recovery from addiction.
Wow.
And some of those philosophies, and I think the oldest is in Japan. And it gets people well. It's a very family-orientated model. Of course it is. Japan is a very family-orientated tradition, as is India to a degree. you can see from everything I've talked about, 12 steps, I'm talking about individuals, because I'm talking about Western society, and Western society is very individualistic, perhaps too individualistic, and that we've lost our way slightly. On the other side, you have very much more family-orientated societies and things. The only reason that we don't know about that Japanese system is for several hundred years Japan was close to the outside world, and because Bill W. happened to come along in 1930s America when mass communication was just beginning. The ability to reach out across entire nations, across the globe and things. But you will find that there have been variations of the 12 steps that predate it, that postdate it. The French have systems, they had their, I'm sure they called it the blue lamp meetings and things, that if you read this book you'll see all kinds of different ways that recovery came into being. The difference was, they didn't have a Bill W. who saw the power of mass communication and mass media, and he managed to get the version he came across spread out and everyone knew about it. So it's not that they didn't exist, they existed, but they never, you know, they travelled by word of mouth and not very far. Bill W. saw that he through mass communication, and then he became aware that he could translate, that people could translate it into different cultures, and by and large, as you know, it kind of works in quite a lot of cultures. Interesting things about Bill W. that may not know: he was a prolific womanizer. He was a very flawed person, which is what I love about him. He's not some guru. He's not some god. He's like me. He's flawed. And he was so flawed that he wasn't allowed, they banned him from the AA officers because he flirted so much with the women there, and they found it so uncomfortable because he was a prolific womanizer. So they got together and said, you know, Bill, we love you to bits and you've done an awful lot of work, but it's time you stood aside now and left the women alone. In other aspects, Bill W., it's in one of the history books, it is documented, Bill W. Clearly understood that spiritual awakenings were not about religion, because he looked at other ways of creating spiritual awakenings, and particularly when he talked about having a psychic experience. And one of the ways he explored with it is with the use of LSD.
Exactly.
And if you really want to stir people up at an AA meeting, it's a very traditional AA meeting, and you want to stir things up and be a little naughty, because I can do that at times. You just quote that. Oh, Bill W. Oh, we don't mention drugs in our meeting. Yeah. It's great fun. It's a bit naughty, but perhaps not what aimed at getting people well. It's fun. Bill W. was a real person.
So just one last comment was, so when I studied CBT and I came back here and I looked at the 12 steps with a fresh perspective, it's sort of like a slap in the face, because essentially 12 steps is CBT. Like when people talk about it,
absolutely,
they say CBT and 12 steps like they're completely different.
So they're not.
They're not, because they both focus on thinking. Just that 12 steps is, like you said, by the layman, for the layman, basically CBT.
Remember, the 12 steps came about in the 30s. Yes. CBT doesn't start getting formally written down and recognised, I think, until the 60s. 60s, late 60s. So, you know what? CBT existed. It wasn't that it didn't exist. It wasn't an invention in the 60s.
Exactly.
It was formalised.
Yes.
So when you look at the 12 steps, Bill W. was a relentless thief. He stole from everywhere. But what do? We all steal from everywhere. That's learning.
And it worked.
It works. 12 steps is packed with CBT.
Absolutely.
It's packed with the influence of Carl Jung, who took his influence from Freud, and that psychodynamic is there. AA meetings is packed with terms that are used that Anna Freud coined. They're sometimes misused, but the terms, they've survived, they're still there. You know, rational emotive behavioural therapy is sort of both in there and works its way in there. As other people come, they've had other treatments and that was useful, they bring it to AA meetings. It builds up into the mythology of AA. You know, these things are all the same.
A lot of therapists do come up to AA.
Yeah.
And when they come in, we can see. This is what I also, many years when I keep seeing this, I learned a lot from them. When people talk. People talked about mindfulness, awareness, living in the now. Then people talked about, like I hear professionals coming up because initially when I started, I had clinical psychologists talking about DBT and all. I go to the meeting, I see a sponsor doing that to the sponsor. Then they talk about rational behavior therapy. Actually people talk about this entire program is a program of feelings. There goes the RBT.
Yes.
And there goes the SMART. And when I look at it, then actually I hear people talking, what religion are you talking? If you are not spiritual, religion is a path to practice your spirituality. You go there. So all these sort of things are available in AA.
Yeah. AA is, it's a distillation.
And that's actually the
of, yeah, it's a distillation of man's understanding of our, and I'm going to use the word in brackets, psychic needs. And along after that has come formalised versions of different therapies. But remember, all research, all therapy is about either discovering truth or discovering ways of helping people. They're all going in the same direction. They may discover different elements of it, but they don't compete with each other, they complement each other. And, you know, my mind says, work in cooperation, don't work in isolation. I've had enough of isolation. I've done that. And you know what? That doesn't work very well. Let's bring it all together. Wherever I'm working, whatever field I'm doing, I'm always seeking to bring things together. I will do what Bill W. does. If you've got a good idea, I will unashamedly steal it and I will use it. I might well credit you with it. I might forget to credit you with it. But you know what? It's still a good idea. Thank you very much.